In today's video, we are going to be discussing some major news surrounding AEW and ROH, potentially a new signing. Also, some plans have been revealed for an AEW star that has not been used. And then, of course, we got to talk about the Hardy Boys. We're going to go into a preview / prediction because the Hardy Boys have been announced for a match for Dynamite. It is March 16, 2022. My name is Zango. For more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. Let's talk about the Hardy Boys. AEW has actually sent out a press release announcing that the Hardy Boys, the Hardys, because they can't go by the Hardy Boys, the Hardys will be taking, they'll be going against Private Party. This match will be taking place on AEW Dynamite tonight, March 16, 2022, which obviously makes sense considering the fact that Private Party kind of turned on Matt Hardy, obviously causing the debut of Jeff Hardy. Now, I mentioned last week when I went live on this channel, I said, one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that AEW needs to get a lot of these tag team matches in on a weekly basis, right? And it starts with Private Party, but TH2, Butcher and the Blade, there's so many tag teams, Dark Order, there's just so many different individuals. We don't know what their future looks like in AEW 5-10 years from now. We don't know what the future looks like for AEW in general. Obviously, the Hardy Boys are a very iconic tag team. And because AEW really treats this tag team division as something special, I said in my live stream before, I said AEW needs to start knocking out these matches. Obviously, the Hardys more than likely are going to go over Private Party, which is unfortunate because I feel like Private Party is just kind of stuck in limbo. But I understand the task at hand. Obviously, the Hardys are going for the chase for the tag team championship belts. Now, again, having these matches on television, whether it's Dynamite and Rampage, can be really significant for the history of AEW because that's the way I'm looking at this. 10 years from now, let's just say Private Party is a very iconic tag team. At that point, the Hardy Boys probably aren't around wrestling. They're probably, they're probably retired, right? So at that point, AEW can actually use this footage to help with documentaries and what it means for Private Party to have risen to the top, and they can look back at these matches, which is why it's so important that I think AEW has these matches. But yeah, AEW is obviously making a big deal between Matt and Jeff teaming up again. Also, it's very interesting. We haven't seen Jeff Hardy with face paint in AEW. I'm curious if we're going to see that because, in ROH, Impact, WWE, we saw Jeff Hardy with the face paint. Obviously, on the indies, we saw him with face paint. So far, we haven't seen him in face paint in AEW. So it's just going to be very interesting. Let me know what you guys think down below. As much as I would like to see the Private Party pull an upset here, it's just very unlikely. All right, guys, I do want to talk about Brian Cage. We provided some updates a week ago. We were talking about these updates on the channel with Fightful Select announcing at that time that AEW picked up the option for Brian Cage, which was very surprising considering that, Brian Cage hasn't obviously been used. I thought this was a very interesting story because Brian Cage, being very vague, was on the Going Broadway podcast, and he actually stated that there is a plan for him to return to TV. There is a plan. I guess that's about as much as I can throw around out there. We'll wait and see. Now, I find this to be a good thing because Brian Cage should be used, especially if AEW is now doing this thing where, they're picking up contracts for people not being used. I always believe that AEW wanted to use Brian Cage. Obviously, there was some bullshit that happened in between, but from now until then, they haven't really done anything. And a lot of people look at that as a failure on AEW's part. I don't look at that necessarily as a failure. I've seen people make that argument. My counter argument to AEW's experience with Brian Cage doesn't necessarily fall on AEW. I do think to a certain extent, the whole ordeal, and I'm speaking from like a fan perspective, the whole ordeal with Brian Cage is he came in pretty early in the company. He was put in some very big marquee matches, right? Obviously, he got the Jon Moxley match in the beginning. And you look at what's transpired since then, there is just a lot of people that, from a fan's perspective, I think AEW prioritizes more than Brian Cage. And it's really hard to put Brian Cage above some of these other people, which sucks. But that's the issue when you do have a large roster. This is the same issue that WWE has. I mean, if you look at WWE and AEW, they face the same problem. They have a lot of freaking talented people on the roster, but you can't use them all. And how do you prioritize one over the other? It's a very difficult decision to make. And I don't necessarily fault AEW for not using Brian Cage, but I can understand why they should use Brian Cage as well. There's a lot of people I'll read in the comments. They often say that Brian Cage he isn't good enough. He isn't good enough. Oh, he should go to WWE. He should go back to Impact. Brian Cage leaving AEW and succeeding in WWE would not, it would look like a blemish on AEW. You know, the idea, the general idea here on the internet wrestling community is that you leave WWE to go to AEW to shine. And it would be very odd to see roles reversed, you know. Not saying WWE can't make Brian Cage a star, but obviously Brian Cage is exactly what Vince McMahon likes, big, strong wrestler, you know. Very interesting to see what transpires here, though, for sure. And I do want to mention, too, really quick, Brian Cage being vague about his plans doesn't guarantee that they actually have plans, right? Technically, plans change. You never know. Maybe they change their ideas. Maybe they change their plans. Obviously, you have Wardlow and Scorpio Sky going for the TNT Championship. Do they throw Brian Cage in the mix? I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, if you are one of those people that let it play out. All right, guys, AEW in talks with a top free agent. I've been wanting to talk about this for a minute now. Jonathan Gresham could possibly be working for Tony Khan. Now, we don't know if it's going to be for AEW or ROH, but Fightful Select dropped a report today that there have been assets produced indicating that John Gresham could be working with Tony Khan. Now, there is no clarity here as to whether or not it's AEW or ROH. Keep in mind, Gresham is the current original ROH World Champion. Bandito is currently holding the new championship belt. They are set to wrestle at Supercard of Honor unless Tony Khan changes plans. You know, it's a tough situation, right, with ROH because technically John Gresham isn't signed to ROH. There's nobody signed to ROH. But this idea that he could finally be coming to AEW is a big thing. Obviously, we talked about in the past with John Gresham being backstage in AEW. You know, and with Fightful Select dropping these reports, it just got me thinking that perhaps maybe AEW does have plans to using John Gresham outside of the ROH bubble, or maybe they have him captain the ship for a while. It's a tough situation, man. This transition phase for ROH is going to be the most interesting thing next to the Cody Rhodes story, because how ROH is presented on TV, you know, it would be like, it's like, you know, Tony Khan is going to own two wrestling companies, and I just think right now I want to be optimistic about it, but when you look at what's on Tony Khan's plate between, you know, football, American football, and then European football, you look at that, and then you look at wrestling, and you look at all these businesses he owns, it's going to be a difficult thing for him to manage, man. I really don't know what's going to come out of it. I hope for the best. Bringing in John Gresham would be really cool, I think, just in general. But to know that there's been assets already produced, I mean, it's pretty much a sure thing that Tony Khan is locking up John Gresham, which it's a no-brainer. This guy is a great wrestler, and I look forward to seeing what he does.